What's good, beautiful people? Welcome back to week 2 of Community Permaculture. Stoked y'all are joining us on this journey from today, the transition from hunter-gatherer societies to agricultural civilizations. And we're going from way back then all the way up to your contemporary balcony garden in your apartment, how to do that ecologically. So, ton of ground to cover. We're doing these kind of extremes, and we're going to start meeting more in the middle in terms of social action and stuff like that as we go. But I think grounding ourselves in a perspective on how people might have done things differently in the past and thus how they might have thought differently than we do can hopefully help us take ourselves out of the water we swim in, this agricultural, civilizational, philosophical water that we just take for granted as, how humans are supposed to interact with each other, their environment, and get food. And give us therefore the ability to have other perspectives emerge, because we're going to need another civilizational paradigm to emerge in order for us to survive. At least that's the hypothesis of some of these thinkers we're going to be looking at first. We start off. Now, this is a lot more than an hour in terms of material. It's about over 3 hours. If you only have 1 hour to spend, as promised, I'd say watch Kiss the Ground. So that's just out front, especially if you're kind of new to this stuff and you're not sure where to start and you still need some perspective and some hope and some kind of, it's very, Kiss the Ground is an excellent, a lot of great information. Kind of has the tone of like an inspirational Chevy commercial a little bit at the end, or like an insurance ad or something like that. It's very almost stock footage looking, and inspirational music playing and stuff, but it really is inspirational. It was, despite maybe some cheese at the end there, it's an awesome film. There's a lot of cool stuff to say about it. So and yeah, all respects to Jason Mraz on not only the music in there but also doing something amazing with your fame and fortune and hard-earned money. So yeah, didn't mean to talk too much trash on Kids the Ground, but just a warning for those who might be a little more want something a little more substantial. I'd say if you really want something substantial, check out the Toby Hemenway. It's about an hour as well. Redesigning Civilization with Permaculture talk. Incredible talk. So we'll get to that. Let's start with a thinker I've come to know recently, Jeremy Lent. The title of the talk is Living into an Ecological Civilization. I love that he said living into, or that it's titled that rather than say fighting for, or battle metaphors, or these other ways that we have to reduce this, or that's all well and good. Yes, we need to accept limitations at certain points, but that's not really, I think, what the mentality shift he's saying we need is about. So let's get into what he talks about in this talk. I'm going to give you a quick overview. This one, if you had to not watch one of them, I'd say skip this one. My overview will give you hopefully the bullet points, but do check out his work if you get a chance. He basically marks this transition from hunter-gatherer or horticultural societies, as some other people might call them, and those are where people, essentially find their food in relation to their environment and therefore understand their connection with their local environment in a very visceral way. And I say hunter-gatherer or horticultural societies intentionally. He marks that sort of society as characterized by nature as a loving parent, as one of, as I said, recognizing this interconnection. If nature is providing all this abundance for us, of course, nature is conceived of as a loving parent. It does that for everyone. There's equality, and it does that through the living beings that represent that divine care. So animism, right, nature having a spirit in it, or their spirits being everywhere, is a natural thing to think if you're recognizing that what I consider divine is providing me through all these various intricate individual means, the basis of my subsistence, my material subsistence at least. He says when we transition to agriculture, and I'll talk specifically about sort of pre-modern agricultural civilization as opposed to horticultural society. And that's because socius, so civilization, comes from civitas, city. Society comes from socius, which means companion. Socius as companion emphasizes the human element, emphasizes human interconnection. Civitas as city emphasizes sort of the buildings, the place, the government, all these things that might be there. A definition I saw: permanent densely settled place with administratively defined boundaries whose members work primarily on non-agricultural tasks. That's the definition of a city, and that's very interesting. There's a couple interesting things in there. We'll get to that when we get to Hemenway. But what marks for Lent the agricultural civilizations are sort of fences, right? That's a paradigmatic image. He says symbolizes their way of relating to their surroundings. He says a hierarchy of the gods, and primarily sky gods who are distant from us. There's not therefore a really intrinsic value in things. The mediation of the priesthood is necessary. There's patriarchy, or the kind of extractive concept of how to relate with nature and our surroundings. And we're going to get to, when we talk about Hemenway's video, he gets into the whys, or some hypothesized whys. Why is that the case? Lent says our third era that we're living in now is in a way an extension of the agricultural civilization, but a exacerbation or exponential amplification of it. So the scientific revolution essentially produces industrial era factory farming and industrial agriculture, right? Which really, as I said, exponentially intensify the extractive logic of agricultural civilization, and emphasize the separation of humanity from nature and from one another. So Latin scientia, knowledge, is ultimately derived from or related to words that have to do with scindere, to cut, to divide, Greek schizane, to split, to rend, to cleave. Gothic, there's a lot of Indo-European versions of this. Skedan, Old English, skaden, to divide, to separate. And in a way, that's kind of what's happening. Not that science is bad. Science has given us much and is an important perspective too, right? We're retaining all of these perspectives as we move forward into something else. And he characterizes that as ecological civilization. So whereas scientific sort of rationality and the industrial agriculture that follows it considers nature to be a machine, something to be used and conquered, and therefore affects these kind of concentrations of wealth through ransacking the earth, essentially, and leads to the greatest inequality of any of the social models we've discussed so far, the greatest division, the greatest separation, the greatest social cleavages. In ecological civilization, Jeremy Lent posits, would be one based on the values of life, a life-based civilization, and values of interconnectedness, which he really emphasizes. So that's a decent summary, I hope, of some of Jeremy's important points. He has a lot more interesting things to say about this, a lot of philosophical things, but I think to what we're talking about, that seems like the most relevant stuff. So let's keep that in mind. I'm going to skip over Kiss the Ground. It's a very accessible introduction to all this, to kind of the soil science. There could be critiques leveled at it. Maybe it's a little bit too, again, white land-owning class perspective based, and it also emphasizes perhaps a little too much the question of carbon sequestration over and above the idea of water cycle restoration. So, critiques in mind, Kiss the Ground is still an excellent film and something you should check out, especially if you're kind of new to this. If you have a little more experience in this world, and or you just want that philosophical approach, check out if you only have 1 hour to designate, check out Toby Hemenway's Redesigning Civilization with Permaculture. Amazing talk. In this one, he really reconstructs and gets into how that transition from hunter-gatherer horticultural society to agricultural civilization might have taken place. So I'll include some screenshots in there. He kind of summarizes the characteristics of both of them. But it's really, his sort of point is that agriculture as a value system and means of production is fundamentally flawed in certain ways. And that doesn't reduce what he's saying. Still check out his talk. But this is kind of a run-through of what I understood as the birth of agricultural civilization out of hunter-gatherer horticultural civilization. So essentially you have social gatherings of people who come together to celebrate these yearly religious rites or festivals. Those gatherings then become sort of stable settlements through whatever means, people like being there, whatever. He says essentially when you start to build, say, monumental architecture, and you start to have this, cadre of people staying there throughout the year instead of going back to their nomadic herds or whatever. You're going to outstrip the resources around that area, so you're going to just start providing for this class of builders and priests. He kind of characterizes, really, this is a religious gathering of people that happens first. So the temple starts the city. The temple is the foundation of the city in a way. And this, as Jeremy Lent has suggested, concentration of spiritual power in a certain place and in certain buildings and in certain people creates this idea of a priesthood, this idea, or solidifies this idea that nature is elsewhere and there's people who can mediate, or that rather spirit is elsewhere and there's people who can mediate spirit to us. It doesn't just come to us through nature. It resides in the temples, rather, in the sanctum sanctorium, etc. So when you have this gathered group of people, he talks a lot about the psychology of such a settlement, right? You begin to potentially, instead of seeing nature as a place that, or the being even that provides you your sustenance, you see it as this enemy. He talks about the birth of the notion of wild lands, which not every language has that notion, especially it's agricultural peoples, he says, that have the idea of wild lands. That's not even a concept in other cultures, right? Because they're not seen as separate. So when you're an agriculturalist, you see the wolves that could come eat your sheep, or the deer that could come eat your whatever you're growing, your plants, as the enemy, as uncontrollable, as something to combat against and to try to control. And this is where a fear-based, scarcity-based, authoritarian sort of mentality begins. And he describes this process specifically in relation to grain crops. So this is a very interesting part of this. I want to emphasize this. Unlike many other sorts of food, grain crops are a storable surplus. So other things will go bad, but you dry out a little seed and you can keep that for a pretty long time compared to, say, a root or tuber, maybe even a squash, which you're going to get maybe 1-2 years out of max, grain, 7 years or more, the famous biblical story I'm referring to, obviously. But when you have grain being grown to provide, you have all of a sudden the need for a place in which it is stored, the need for a place for someone to guard this surplus of wealth that you're creating. And along with that comes people to distribute it. So he says the person who controls the food supply, in Old English, loaf-lord or something like that. It's like loaf warden. So the guardian of the loaf. That's the origin of our term lord, of the whole notion of aristocracy and royalty, in a way, comes from who controls the food supply. And when you have agriculture and grain crops being the dominant mode of food production, you have, again, a place to store them. You have people who you need to distribute them, accountants to measure them, rules to regulate how they're measured, how they're collected and distributed, punishments for anyone who breaks these rules. So you have a sudden emergence of an entire civilizational architecture, social bureaucratic architecture, that in a way is, what it's doing is converting other formerly, say, wild habitat into human beings. So it's taking those, leveling them, eroding topsoil and creating people out of landscapes. And that's what we've been doing a lot, is converting wild energy, the energy of nature, into a sort of increased fertility that we're seeing is in a way not sustainable. Not that fertility or human fertility is not sustainable, but the way our population surge has met with the agriculture, which declines, right? This crisscross line of increased people and declining production, because degrading the basis of that production. Of course, you're going to get a lot of things. So he mentions other things like, that population increase having to do with women. There's a lot in there about soft foods, weaning children earlier. Therefore, sort of continual pregnancy is possible. So population boom and female disempowerment, as we've seen in other contexts, go hand in hand potentially. And I want to make it very clear, I think anyone who thinks that reducing population through any other means besides female education and access to birth control is dangerously unimaginative in their engineering, or their thinking about, biological engineering, because we have, and not by that I don't mean genetic engineering, I mean engineering the biology of the planet to provide for the people that are here, which is very, very possible. So the way we're doing it now, not possible. There are many other models that would make it very possible, I believe. But he basically lays out all the derogatory things that happen when agriculture comes into the picture. Humans, the skeletal record shows in certain areas where you have a transition from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, you have that full skeletal record from all the way back. You see that people are shorter, that they die sooner, they have more degenerative diseases, they have more epidemic diseases. So, as you know, zoonotic, coming from an animal, illnesses come mainly from domesticated animals. So, chickenpox, bird, avian flu, whatever, all from fowl. You got smallpox and mad cow disease from cows, measles and mumps, swine flu from pigs, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on, right? Increased famines as well because you decrease the diversity of the food supply, so you're depending on one thing. Whereas a hunter-gatherer, if that was short, they could go find this. In this case, you're monocropping everything, so if that crop dies, you're effed. You're out of luck. Um, and then, of course, long term, as Jared Diamond has pointed out, soil degradation precedes civilizational collapse. In almost all the cases that he looks at, Easter Island, Rome, I think he goes through Greece, a whole bunch of different things. You have soil degradation and erosion leading to the civilization collapsing. So that's what we're involved in right now ourselves in our current model of farming. So yeah, there's so much in here. A couple other highlights really quick. I love this one. He said, I think it's Derek Jensen, he mentioned, if you think your sustenance comes from the store, your wallet, a tap, your job, then you'll defend that system to the death. If your sustenance comes from the land, you'll defend that to the death. So the illusion that our food comes from our wallet or comes from our job or comes from these other things that it doesn't come from, those are intermediaries, makes people scared to lose those elements. Whereas really none of those are necessary for your actual survival. They're all social constructs that we use to mediate a very complicated agricultural civilization. So he basically says sustainable agriculture is an oxymoron. He proposes sustainable horticulture instead. He says really in permaculture is kind of envisioning a horticultural as opposed to an agricultural society. Permaculture was originally from permanent agriculture, but really if you emphasize culture, then you see the broader picture of culture is growing, cultivating things, and that could be mines, that could be wild plants that can provide food, or that could be a giant 17-acre field of just one wheat or something like that. So yeah, so I like his kind of he also points out just briefly two other incredibly important points, that horticulture comes from plant life. So again, we're back to socius versus civitas. Plant agriculture is field. So horticulture deals with plants, aka the individual life that you're talking about. Agriculture deals with creating fields. So literally leveling and destroying, say, topography in order to create a flat field that you can grow usually one thing on, or rows of things on. And that's a very different perception. So horticulture, life culture, plant culture, field agriculture, ag culture is a leveling sort of culture, and it actually creates massive, through its leveling, through its kind of pyramidal leveling, it creates these massive hierarchies with extreme inequality, which just do not exist. If you look at the anthropological record of hunter-gatherer societies, they're definitely not, they don't have the extremes of inequality that we have. So one other super crucial quote from him: life creates the conditions for more life. I've heard them say that a couple times, and I love that one. And that's just a reminder that instead of everything sort of being entropic and every time there's life we're destroying, we're taking from something in order to live, that's a scarcity mentality. That's not necessary. That's kind of something that really rules a lot of our ecological thinking sometimes, right? People who, good eco-crusaders who are out there saying, you're bad, humans are consuming, we've got to just reduce consumption and fight, carbon emissions. And absolutely, yes, stop blowing unnecessary, gas into our faces, please, and myself included. Let's chill out as much as we can. But really, that's kind of like an oversimplification, and that's a further a reduction of everything to carbon or reduction of everything to consumption is entropy. Whereas he's saying, no, life can be structure building, life can be pattern creating. Life creates the conditions for more life, which creates the conditions for more life. So that's order building on order. He gives a couple examples of like how this permacultural thinking and acting can be applied at a community level as well. So just quickly rush through the rest of these. There's a John D. Liu video in there that you don't have to watch it, but if you want to get a sort of jump start on next week, we're going to be talking more about large-scale regenerative projects for large-scale ecosystem sort of thinking. So, having hope that we can regenerate large swathes of the earth. It's already being done. It's already been done in multiple parts of the world. And it proves that we can do it. It proves that we can connect, globally on this issue and take giant action. So he looks at desertification as a global issue, in this case, particularly China and Africa, and some mega projects that are helping to fix that. The next thing available for you down there is just some watershed info. So I want us to be aware of what our watershed is here in LA. So get it sort of, and that's just an Instagram post I had done. It's, not perfect, it's very basic, but it'll just hopefully show you and get you a sense of, one, that we live in a collective watershed, and two, that how we've treated that watershed and how we managed it actually reflects the health outcomes on the ground. So I think that's a crucial thing. There's a case study in there for you to read if you want to check out some more stuff on the LA River. It's a great piece of writing. We'll talk more about that. That's something, again, we're going to keep developing. And then there's something in there for you on just ecological balcony gardening, right? There's a lot to consider when you're growing plants and you want to do it ecologically. Like even, the peat moss that's mined to make a lot of this stuff, or the cocoa coir that's shipped from all the way over there, or the plants that are shipped from blah, blah, blah. There's a lot in it. This article is not going to, go into all the dirty details on how to be the most ecologically, but all you need to do is get started. That's the point. Do whatever you can with whatever you have. And this article will give you some great tips on how to do that inexpensively, how to do that ecologically. So check it out. Anything you find in there helpful. I disagree with a few things, but that's totally fine. We're allowed to do that. So I'd say the only things I'd recommend are, you don't need as much planning as she might make it seem, and you don't need as much day care. They don't need as much babysitting as it might seem as well. A little bit does go a long way. So, if you heed her stuff, you will be rewarded, but also just get started. Whatever you can do, just get started with something. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you'll enjoy the videos for this week. I hope you've been enjoying the class. Please hit me up if you have any questions, or you want to know about something in particular. You want me to pursue a certain path of learning, or you want me to share a video with other people that you think is really impactful. I'd love to see the video or article or whatever. So thank y'all. Andale.